Let's discuss the different planes first. The sagittal plane divides the body into a left and a right section. The frontal plane divides the body into a front and a back section. The transversal or horizontal plane divides the body into an upper and a lower half. When an osteokinematic movement takes place in a certain plane, bones rotate around an axis. When a movement takes place in a sagittal plane, we are seeing a rotation around or perpendicular to the transversal, also called frontal axis. When we see a movement in the frontal plane, we are describing a rotation around the sagittal axis. You can remember the sagittal axis from the zodiac sign Sagittarius, who is shooting an arrow through your heart. Lastly, when we see a movement in a transversal plane, we are describing movement around the longitudinal axis. During observation of a certain movement in a certain plane, you should take the following position: perpendicular to the respective plane, in the extension of the axis around which the movement takes place. Before you describe a movement in a joint, you should ask yourself how many degrees of freedom this joint has. As the shoulder joint is a ball and socket joint, morphologically and functionally its level of freedom is 3, which means it can move in all 3 planes. If we are moving the shoulder in the sagittal plane, it means that we are moving around the transversal axis. These movements in the shoulder joint are called flexion or anteversion, or extension or retroversion. If we are moving the shoulder in the frontal plane, we are moving around the sagittal axis. These movements are called abduction and adduction. The hip joint is a ball and socket joint and therefore has 3 degrees of freedom as well. If we are moving the hip in the sagittal plane, we are moving around the transversal axis. These movements are called flexion and extension. If we are moving the hip in the frontal plane, we are moving around the sagittal axis. These movements are called abduction and adduction. Knee joint. The knee joint is morphologically and functionally a hinge joint, which means that it only has 1 degree of freedom. It can only move in one plane. The only real movements that can happen in the knee joint are flexion and extension. As we have learned, these movements only take place in a sagittal plane around the transversal axis. We will neglect the minimal amount of internal and external rotation in the transversal plane, as well as abduction and adduction in the frontal plane. The movements of the shoulder in the transversal plane around the longitudinal axis are called external or lateral rotation and internal or medial rotation. The movements of the hip in the transversal plane around the longitudinal axis are called external or lateral rotation and internal or medial rotation.
Each and every movement in our body occurs in an axis and plane. Axis and plane are actually an imaginary concept, and its study is very important to understand the human movement and its anatomy. In this video, we are going to learn the 3 types of axis and planes and its characteristics. Let us take this elbow movement. As you can see, as elbow moves, this movement of elbow can be defined into an axis and in an plane. So this axis actually passes through the joint and where actually the movement occurs, and the plane where the moving surface or the forearm moves. Axis and plane always remain perpendicular to each other, that is in 90 degree with each other. There are three types of plane: frontal plane, sagittal plane and transverse plane. Let us start with frontal plane. Frontal plane remains perpendicular with the ground and it divides body into front, that is anterior, and back, that is posterior. One of the example, the abduction of shoulder and adduction of the shoulder, movement in an frontal plane. Sagittal plane. Sagittal plane also lies perpendicular with the ground and it divides body into right and left. Elevation of shoulder is the best example of movement in an sagittal plane. Next is transverse plane. Transverse plane remains parallel with the ground and it divides the body into upper and lower part, that is it cross sects the body. As you can see, the internal and external rotation of the shoulder with the elbow flexed is one of the example of movement of body in a transverse plane.